Okay, so here's a quick sort of tour of my picture. So I started with Archer's diagram where she's driven this, created this Venn diagram of natural order and social order interacting with practical order at the interface. Now I think there are a number of issues with this, and I was thinking about so actually the practical order she's seeing at the interface of natural order and social order. So maybe you can draw this in two ways in a sense, and there's natural order which has some sort of boundary drawn around it to distinguish it from social order, and vice versa. You've got social order with a boundary to distinguish itself from natural order. Now the real question is what's happening at the boundary, and what I'm suggesting is that there's some sort of transduction process, there's some sort of conversion of information within the social order which gets somehow transferred into ideas or concepts about the natural order, and vice versa. There's something about the natural order which somehow gets transferred or converted into ideas about the social order. So I think this is more useful. I think, in a sense, Archer's presenting her diagram as a sort of static thing, and to me, it's a much more dynamic, conversational or transductive process. But then the transduction itself is doing a particular job, and I think the job that it's really doing is to do with the fact that any distinction about nature or any distinction about the social is essentially unstable. There's some inherent uncertainty about it, because you can draw, the natural order in a box like this, but you kind of think, well, actually, there's, what is the distinction that says something inside the box is natural and something outside the box isn't? What is that distinction? And so that's where I sort of come to drawing these different kinds of diagrams down here. I'll explain that in a minute. So here I've got my box around nature, and the question mark represents this fundamental uncertainty about the maintenance of that distinction. And actually the issue is really that if you're going to maintain that distinction about nature, you have to do something to mop up this uncertainty so that the uncertainty doesn't actually destabilize the distinction. And so this is where I'm seeing the idea of order, as Archer describes it, as a kind of imposition on the unstable distinction. So actually what she's doing in talking about natural order, she's conflating the idea of a distinction about nature with the imposition of an order on nature, which actually has the function of maintaining the stability of the distinction about nature. I'm hoping that's understandable. But it gets more complicated than that, because there's a sort of topology that unfolds from this, because once you say, okay, so I'm going to mop up the internal uncertainty of my distinction about nature, I can't just do that, because obviously I'm trying to mop up the uncertainty of the internal distinction against the context of an external environment. So on the left here, I've got my external environment. So there has to be an associated function which is looking at your mopped up distinction, or your distinction about nature, which is internally addressing its uncertainty. It has to fit with whatever environment it's in. And so that's why I've said there's this second function that sort of unfolds from this, which is trying to balance the internal management of the distinction with the external expression of that distinction against the things which are going on in the world. And obviously any distinction about nature which doesn't fit that which is going on in the world is not going to be a very good distinction about nature. But it means that you've got this dynamic process between your imposed order and the fit of that imposed order with the environment. And then finally, really what you've got to do is to balance out these two distinctions. Now, that gets more interesting when you start to actually look at the sort of social dynamics of this, and you say, okay, so if you look at Archer's distinctions between natural order and the social order, you can say actually there are two distinctions there. One being made about nature, which is trying to mop up its own internal uncertainty and balance it with what's happening in the environment. And you've also got a distinction about the social, which is doing the same thing. It's trying to mop up its internal uncertainty. And so you have the imposed order of the social that's trying to do this, which is also trying to then express its mopped up uncertainty. It's trying to express that and fit it with the environment that it finds itself in. And also it has the same function to balance the expressed fit of the structure with the imposed order. But this is all going into an environment which both of these distinctions are sharing. So there is an environment where there are productions which result from our judgments or imposition of order on nature, and that environment includes our expressions of our imposed order about the social. And the challenge that these two distinctions have, and this is at the heart of this transduction process, which I think is, in a sense, the transduction is two-way. It's going internally and it's going externally. So it's a sort of horizontal level of transduction and a vertical level. And really, where we find ourselves is trying to balance both distinctions within a shared environment, within which that shared environment is carrying the necessary productions of the expression of each system as it tries to maintain its own distinctions. That's quite a convoluted sentence, but I'm hoping that somehow that makes sense. Now, then we have to think about, okay, so how do we relate this? So this is all about Archer. How do we relate this to things like high-frequency trading? Or more relevantly, I think, perhaps to the way that we use technology more generally. Now, I think that the algorithmic technology is a way of imposing an order on the social. So when we create algorithms, we're really making an intervention at the imposed order stage. And this is a problem in the sense that it, whilst it maintains a distinction about the social, it's a distinction about the social which is partly determined by the manner in which we choose to impose order on it. And that's a sort of rather more convoluted way of saying that we allow technology to create problems it can solve. And I think, inevitably, of course, because it creates problems it can solve, the problems that it generates end up in the shared environment within which other distinctions are trying to achieve a balance. Now, the question, and I think that one of the things that I'm really thinking very much about, and to a certain extent, this is what I wrote my book about education. This is what this addresses, is whether our technologies should be more focused on expressing our uncertainty about our distinction. So it's much more to do with the fit, so that we use our technologies as a means of expression, as a means of creativity, as a means of actually putting out multiple versions of our understanding into a shared environment, so that actually it's our human organizational processes that can then process those different representations of reality and establish a more effective way of maintaining our distinctions. I think that would be a better way. And actually, this is why I'm slightly allergic to the sort of very heavy critique of the things that technology is doing, in a sense, because I feel that a better way of approaching this is actually quite a small shift in emphasis in the way that we actually use our technologies. Okay, so I hope that makes sense.